You remember back in your days in college, unless you guys are still in college and you ended up going to like one of those websites to get an assignment in, it's because you were late, you procrastinated like hell, so you decided you were going to hit up one of those like essay websites. You tried to grab a torrent of someone's schoolwork from like years prior to see if you could use that to skirt in on an assignment that you just couldn't be bothered to finish on your own. That's literally what Greed is Good is doing to Dark and Darker right now. It's just a copy where they're changing around a few sentences and hoping to God the professor doesn't notice. A little less than 2 months ago, Iron Mace Games, the developer of Dark and Darker, was able to finally push its version of Dark and Darker, its alpha release, into early access, having to utilize its own launcher even, considering that it was delisted from Steam following a court case that has been run through the ringer in both the United States and in Korea, courtesy of Nexon, who says that Iron Mace stole their project. Since then, there has been a ton of different court litigation stuff that has been going on. There's an appeal in U.S. court now, and of course, it's all bogged down in the Korean court, and we still don't know whether or not the game will ever be relisted on Steam. But of course, that doesn't stop other game dev studios from trying to swoop in and capture some of that market share away from Iron Mace in the midst of their legal battle. Enter the game Greed is Good, now located on Steam for a free-to-play access weekend where they're running the game through its paces, and anyone and everyone that wants to play it can play it right now. But there's some interesting stuff about this game that I want to go into that I think is absolutely pertinent. Like, a whole bunch of stuff seems heavily, one would say, kindly would say, heavily inspired by that of Dark and Darker. And yeah, let's go into the details. Anyone that has played Dark and Darker, for the most part, I think, is relatively familiar at this point with its meteoric rise to supposed success, where they saw some 160,000 concurrent players at one point in time and a couple of million unique accounts. So yeah, we could say that if it had been able to stay on Steam, it probably would have been a multi-million unit banger of a game. Unfortunately, they got forced into having to start this game up in their own launcher, which delayed not only their early access, but also curbed an awful lot of sales, with an awful lot of people saying that they were just waiting for the Steam release and are hopeful they'll be able to play it then. So it's suffice to say natural, I guess, that you would see some other dev studios kind of trying to swoop in to share in this limelight. And there are a few different games that are trying to do it, but this is focusing on this particular one, Greed is Good. According to their own lore, you are playing as a bounty hunter with the goal of finding precious treasures in this dungeon where danger lurks on every side of these dark tunnels, such as skeletons, zombies, poisonous insects, as well as an even more dangerous being, other bounty hunters. Their description reads, opportunity and danger are both present, life and death are just a matter of chance, find the rare portal, and then you can survive. So descriptively, it already sounds very similar to that of Dark and Darker, let's be honest. But that is not where the similarities end. In fact, the game is full of similarities and, if I may go as far as to say, outright copies of what Dark and Darker provides as mechanics. Now, let's call a spade a spade. Dark and Darker uses online Unreal Engine Asset Store marketplace assets. So you can go there and buy them for retail for between $40 and $100 for a bunch of different asset packs. They've assembled these in a certain arrangement that gives them specific ways that things are animated, certain UI elements, obviously certain animations that have been curated and handmade from people inside of the studio, and then obviously we have the game's flow and direction. Along with that, there are also class systems, armor that is worn obviously, and then we have the individual skill breakdown. When you're designing a game like this, think of it kind of like you have a set of musical notes, like you were going to make a song, and then the arrangement of those musical notes is what creates the melody. Those melodies are things that companies try to protect, and this is not me trying to say that there's any type of copyright infringement or any of the like. I'm merely pointing out the starkingly shocking similarities between both of these games. For starters, here's a list of skills and abilities that are so similar or just outright the same that they can't be overlooked. In Greed is Good, they don't actually have class names. Instead, what they did is they took these bounty hunters and they named each of the individual bounty hunters. But when you start taking a look at each one of these hunters, you start realizing that they're just different classes. There's a thief or a rogue class, there's a ranger class, there's an obvious fighter, there's an obvious barbarian, and then there are two what appear to be wizards, one centralized around ice and the other one around fire. But back to the list of skills and abilities, and this isn't even all of them, by the way. There are more. First, we have the Fighter's Second Wind, Fighter's Sprint, the Ranger Quick Reload, Ranger's Triple Shot, the Ranger's Bear Trap, the Barbarian's Savage Roar, the Barbarian's Savage Skill, the Barbarian's Rage Skill, the Barbarian's Robust Skill, the Cleric's Protection Spell, and the Rogue's Smoke Pot. Also for the Rogue, dagger attacks, like for the Castian, Rondel, and Chris daggers, named something else for this game obviously, are either totally identical for the Castian or omit one of the several strikes that you would see in Dark and Darker typically, and in the case of something like the Chris and the Rondel, they still give the same hand animations for the strikes that those skills still use. In fact, almost all of the UI elements used for the aiming reticle, including the animations that the reticle uses to denote the path that your melee swings follow, look nearly identical to that of Dark and Darker. If I put them side by side, I don't know if I could tell the difference without knowing which one they were in advance. And then there are the environments, like this boss circle room on the first floor of Crypts in Dark and Darker, looking very similar to one of the promo screenshots that are provided for the game. You can actually walk right into this room inside of Greed is Good. And this, of course, is aside from the game's name, Greed is Good, almost sounding like a shot across Iron Mace's bow. And then, of course, there's game flow. On a macro scale, mechanically, the games are also nearly identical. There's a tavern that looks eerily reminiscent of the earliest playtests of Dark and Darker. You know, the one that they likely switched out for a field camp because of legal claims made by Nexon. Minus Otto, of course, the dog, where 9 people in solo and 18 people in trios go into a darkly lit dungeon full of monsters that share most of the same exact attack animations and attack patterns as the mobs in Dark and Darker, right down to the spiders having a jar that they spawn from, whereby you loot treasure, break clay pots, open treasure chests, attack monsters, and then participate in PvP in a medieval setting where a battle royale-esque circle pushes you ever toward a final choke point, and along the way there are blue portals that you access that look like cracked blue stones that spawn that you can take to go out of the dungeon, or a cluster of 3 red portals that look like cracked red stones that you take to go down a level into more difficult levels like Inferno from Dark and Darker. There are several vendors that represent consumables, armor, weapons, a treasure collection merchant, and of course a shady dealer where you can gamble gold for potentially better gear rolls. They even have a quote-unquote crafting system where you can get either blue rolled items or purple rolled items using 2 different colored stones that you find in the game that are either blue or red. Weird. When looking into the developer of the game, they list themselves on Steam as the Fool's Studio, quote unquote. But there are no Google search results nor any other record of the studio or its past projects. However, in the terms of service, the TOS doesn't reference the studio by this name. Instead, it refers to the game's studio as Flame Dragon, who also has no online presence historically that I could find on Google or anywhere else at all. The developer is apparently a newcomer to game dev or has not bothered to establish an online presence aside from this first offering, which apparently has been very heavily inspired, one could say, very heavily inspired by that of Iron Mace's Dark and Darker. There, of course, is obviously this rumor that's been floating around that it is an undermining attempt to capture the Steam audience away from Dark and Darker by Nexon, who is doing some behind-the-scenes investing into getting this Project P3 off the ground via a third party, but with there being no evidence of this, I find this to be a bit of a reach. However, I do believe that this game dev is absolutely trying to capitalize on Dark and Darker not being available on Steam right now. If Dark and Darker were available on Steam, I do not think that this game would exist. The only reason this game exists is because Dark and Darker does not on this marketplace. Now, all of that being said, there are some benefits to this game. I don't want to say that it's wholly negative. It's not. There's actually a good list here of things that I believe that the game studio is doing right. The first, and all of this comes down to quality of life, by the way. Mechanically, I don't find the game to be all that enticing. It feels very janky, and they need to do a lot of animation work still. But from a quality of life standpoint, marketplace elements and the UI elements for that marketplace are really nice. You can list items like an auction house with filtering mechanics, which is not something that you can do in Dark and Darker. Dark and Darker has a text-based merchant system. The ability to place, buy, and sell orders for specific items that you are looking for is pretty sweet. Secondarily, there's also floating combat text above the enemy to give you an idea of whether you hit a headshot or an arm or the chest. However, it stands to note that because of this, it also highlights that the damage calculations that they are doing on things like chest, arms, and head are the same types of damage calculations that are being done in Dark and Darker. The calculations are identical. They are based on whether you hit a sweet spot of the weapon as well, or if you hit a sour spot, evident by the combat text again, and again is indicative of something that is exactly the same as Dark and Darker, right down to where those sour and sweet spots are on each weapon. Another nice addition are multiple stash tabs, which are also additionally purchasable with in-game currency to expand that stash even further, and that stash is shared with all of your other characters, along with the ability to tab over and see what items your other characters are wearing, with the ability to swap that to your current character in real time. There is also an in-game friends list, but this is basically just Steam's doing and being reskinned over because they are using Steam. Steam provides these things to the player base along with VoIP, by the way, that already has all of these terms of service and whatnot knocked out, which again makes this very, very easy and very streamlined for game developers, which is something that Iron Mace does not have the luxury of having to deal with right now. There is also magical and physical power affixes on gear, but there doesn't seem to be any flat plus damage to the gear, which I suppose is a step in a more desirable direction for most people, but this makes combat last significantly longer than Dark and Darker's current gameplay. The tooltips for the items in the game are also much more detailed and have a base amount of magic resist and bonus hit points as quality improves for each of those items, with random affixes to boot. There is also an overhead icon that you can see in the heads-up display over every player that indicates the quality of armor that they're wearing in each of the major armor slots in order to give an opponent an understanding of what they would be in for when fighting them, unlike what Dark and Darker has, where you really can't tell in the case of most battles until you start fighting them. I'm not sure if I personally find this to be of benefit, as I think it's a little too hand-holdy for me, but I can see where others would find this to be valuable to them. Honestly, when it comes to the quality of life things that are in this game, it looks like that they just kind of read the Reddit posts that people had been making about what quality of life items other people would like to see that Dark and Darker wasn't providing them, and then just kind of added those items. Now, all that being said, there are some slight differences, but the majority of the differences come down to the caster classes. The two caster classes are probably the furthest from that of Dark and Darker, even though they offer up items like Frost Shield and Ice Bolt and Fireball, but they're such common tropes that you can't really compare them. Also, they break the wizard from Dark and Darker into two different characters. One is focused on fire, and the other is focused on ice. They also opted to switch away from a spell count mechanic to instead using a mana bar, which is used for both of the pure casters, the cleric, and the ranger, with the rogue utilizing some energy bar-like bar, which is very similar, reminiscent of the rogue from World of Warcraft, which is expended while the rogue sneaks around or uses one of their skills. But if I'm being honest, that is where the differences end. Other than those things, the game is basically Dark and Darker. I mean, like, right down to the treasure types and the stuff that you find. I don't even think that there's a piece of treasure or a treasure item anywhere on the map that I looked at, saw, looted, whatever, that didn't look almost exactly like one of the hand-placed treasure items that you would just find in Dark and Darker anyway. And that's not even all. Like, several of the rooms in the game look very similar. The portal mechanics are obviously the same. There's the same number of levels. Like, you go into a level 1, like a crypt-style level, and then you go down to, like, an inferno level. There's only the 2, and then you have to leave. The player count populations on the maps are the same. It's either 9 for solo or 18 for trios. Enemy types and animations, although again, they're purchased from the store's asset packs, all of those are the same. I didn't see an animation where an enemy was attacking in any way that looked different than anything else I saw in Dark and Darker already. It even had the mummy lunge attack on like a couple of different enemies. They looked the same. But even right down to the rangers like bows. The arrow counts on things like the short bow. The short bow had 7 arrows, just like in Dark and Darker. The longbow had 5 arrows, just like in Dark and Darker. You pressed R to reload, and the reload animation sounded exactly the same and took the same amount of time. It's an obvious copy, and I don't know if they're doing it because they're paying homage, but it looks more like, to me, that it is something where they're just trying to capitalize on the market that Iron Mace can't have because it can't get onto Steam right now. And I'm not saying the competition is bad. It's not. To me, though, and again, this is just one man's opinion, if somebody were going to create a game that is going to be Dark and Darker-esque, my hope is that they would iterate on the IP a little bit and do more than just provide some UI assets and an auction house style marketplace where we could see some additional stuff that was worth doing inside of this dungeon crawler game. Like, give us Mordhau-style combat mechanics. If you wanted to change something, one of the largest complaints that a lot of the sweats in the game have is that you can't control where the swings come from. Do that. Just as an idea. That would modify the genre and move it in some type of a direction, at least. In this case, the flanged mace that you get as part of the starter kit for the cleric, for example, has the same exact attack pattern as the flanged mace inside of Dark and Darker. It's the same attack pattern. I think it takes the same amount of time even. It looks almost identical. It is so similar that you might as well just call it like good value Dark and Darker at this point. And to me, for that reason, for me, it is a pass. I don't see any reason in delving into a game that I can go and play when Dark and Darker exists, because they're the ones that are originating on it. They're the ones iterating on the IP. They're the ones adding to the IP. And so far, this Game Greed is good. It does not look like it's doing anything else other than just following in the trail directly behind the guys carving the path. That's what it looks like to me. Anyway, guys, that's, like I said, that's just my opinion. I'm not hating on the devs. I'm not hating on anybody that enjoys this game. I really am just looking at it as it doesn't look like anything new. And that to me is a problem, because I feel like the game won't have any real staying power then. It's really just them trying to capitalize on it and get some money as a result of hype around the genre that Iron Mace is carving the path for. That's it. Anyway, guys, that's what I have for this one. Thanks so much for coming and checking it out. Once again, my name is Onepeg. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subbing to the channel. That would be really awesome. For those of you that are going to TwitchCon, I'll be at TwitchCon in Vegas toward the end of the month. Would look very forward to meeting and saying hi to any and all of y'all if you're going to be out that way. Please come shake my hand. That would be pretty sweet. Otherwise, come by the streams and hang out sometime over at twitch.tv/Onepeg, and I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, thanks, everybody. Peace.